Hello everyone, my name is Josh Reynolds and welcome to the first episode of my new Sony Vegas Pro tutorial series. In this episode, I'll be covering layouts, project properties, clip properties, basic editing, and rendering. I've set Vegas Pro back to the default layout because I wanted to talk a little bit about how a layout can affect your workflow. The point of a layout is to enable you to have easy access to tools you frequently use while still giving you a decent amount of screen real estate in order to clearly see the project you're working on. The default Vegas Pro layout is a great example of trying to do too much with too little screen real estate. There are several tools in here I personally do not use, so let's go over this layout and see what I do and do not like. Hopefully I'll be able to save you a little bit of screen real estate. Over here is the Project Media menu. There's several other tabs in here which are actually all windows in themselves. They're all just docked. Now, the Explorer menu, that's probably going to be very familiar for a lot of you, but most editors do not use the Explorer. They mostly work with Project Media because it will give them better access to media bins to have better organization, and better organization will help. It'll save a lot of time if you lose track of a clip and a clip goes offline. So as long as you can keep organized, it will be way better to use Project Media, and you're not going to have to go through several Explorer menus to try to find your clips. Now the Transitions menu I also like because it gives you a visual representation of what all the transitions do. Normally I would not really use a lot of these, but in some situations it's nice to have clear access to the transitions, because you never know when a effect could help or harm a clip. So keep that in mind. I usually leave this enabled. Video effects, very similarly to transitions, give you a visual representation of what they do. Usually I do not actually access the visual effects from this menu, but I like to leave this enabled just so I can see what they do, just so I have a better idea of what I'm going to do to my clip. Now, the media generators, you can typically access directly through a video track. You can insert generated media, and then text media, empty events, etc. So you don't really need it. I tend to leave this enabled, but if you want, you can disable this as well. Now, right next to this menu, we have the trimmer window. For professional editors, you're going to be very used to seeing the trimmer window, making subclips, etc. Just basically editing with a subclip because it allows you to avoid using the actual clip. That's not necessary in Vegas Pro. Usually you can just drag the clip into the timeline and basically make a subclip from that. And honestly, this is pretty much unnecessary, so I like to disable that as well. Now, because I disabled that, I saved a lot of screen real estate here on the top. I can actually drag over the video preview window, drag this down maybe a little bit, and I have a much bigger preview. It's very helpful to have a bigger preview because you'll be able to see how your edits affect the video more clearly. But if you have an external display, you can always just drag this onto the external display and have a much bigger preview and have more screen real estate. Right now I'm working from a laptop to do this video, so I don't have an external display to drag this onto, but if I did, it'd be over here, and I'd have all this room to work with the timeline, and that would be very helpful because it will give you more room to work with multiple clips, and let's be honest, sometimes the timeline can get pretty crowded down here. Now over here is the audio bus. It's the master. Adjusting this clip will adjust how loud the audio is for the entire project. So if all your clips are blown out, that is the proper time to adjust the slider. Typically that does not happen, so usually I disable this. It usually doesn't give that much extra screen real estate. honestly, you should not be recording that many blown out clips in the first place, so I tend to not even need it. Now, down here, you can see the timeline. You can add multiple tracks. I'll add an audio track to go with the video track, and they're all here. You can scroll through them. If you can get more room for the timeline, it helps. You can adjust the size of these, which can help. I don't do it very often, but you can do it. You can drag this forward as well. I don't tend to do that very often either, because I tend not to need to. Down here we have a playback. We can actually drag this forward towards 1, and it'll play it back at that. This is basically a way to see things at different rates without having to set the clip to that rate. For a more traditional control, we have record here, which is when we set the audio to record and click the record button, we can start recording a voiceover, which I could actually be doing in Sony Vegas right now. Sony Vegas actually started as an audio editing program, so it actually has a lot of good tools for editing audio. There's a loop feature, so if you are working on your project and you set a selection, you can actually loop that selection and play back the loop. There is play from start, which actually is really helpful, because otherwise when you click play, it'll play from the position you're at, but of course I was at the end of the loop, so it started it from the start. But if I was right here, it would start playing it from there. So if I go with play from start, it'll play it from the start of the project. There's a pause button. There is a stop button. There's go to start, go to end, and then previous frame, next frame, which can help if you need to just move ahead by a single frame. But typically, if I need to move ahead by a single frame, I'll just push the up button several times to expand my timeline, and then just push the right or left buttons to move ahead by a single frame. And you can see that it's moving ahead by a single frame, because this here is frames, seconds, minutes, hours. So I'm moving a single frame at a time. You can push down to collapse the timeline again. Alright, and so that's kind of the basics of this, of basically layout. This is typically how I like to have Vegas set up on a smaller display. Of course, I'd have a much bigger timeline if I could move the video preview window off. But you want to have a big preview, and you can also click this button to preview it on an external monitor, which can help. Alright, so we have our layout set up, so now we should adjust the project properties. You can click this button here to adjust it, or you could just make a new project. And no, we'll not save that. And it brings up the same project properties window. Alright, so there are several templates in here. An interesting thing to note is there is no preset already made for 1080p at 30 frames a second. There is 60, 30, etc. for 720p, but 1080p is limited to 24p. There are several ways you can get around that. You can actually click this button here, the Match Media Settings, and that will actually allow you to select a video clip, and it will actually copy the properties of that clip to the properties of the project. So the project will match the clips. However, typically what I do is I start with a 720p 30 clip. That's typically what I work in, because I usually work off my laptop because I'm not always home and I don't always have access to my big beefy desktop. And if I do work in 1080, I just go 1920 by 1080. I can leave all the other settings the same, and that would be fine. If you want, you can actually change the name and then click Save to save a template, and then you'll have a template on this list for you to work from. One other thing I tend to use is I tend to put it on best. The quality difference is not the greatest. Well, I shouldn't say not the greatest. It's not a huge difference. It tends to use a couple extra effects to make the final quality a lot better. However, it's not something that you'll actually see on YouTube. So if you're working for the best possible quality for something that's going to be on physical media, you can go best. If you're going to work off YouTube, like a lot of people, you can stay on good. I just tend to like best because, honestly, I can deal with the extra time, and I have a really good upload speed, so I try to save as much quality as possible. Now, if you were working in 1080i, 1080i is upper field first. You can set the field order for an interlaced image, and you can see that when I changed it, it gave us the template for 1080i. Now I'm going to switch this back to 720/30 because that's what I'm working in. We actually also have the option to work in stereoscopic 3D. I don't have any 3D footage, so I'm not going to use that. There's several types of motion blur, deinterlace method. If you're working with interlaced footage but want to work in a progressive project. And audio, you can actually adjust the sample rate. You can actually go in and work in a 5.1 surround sound audio project. You can adjust bit depth, resample, resample and stretch quality. I tend to click best. It doesn't really make a huge difference unless you're resampling a lot of video. Say if you're going to extremely stretch a clip, that's when it tends to make a bigger difference. The ruler time format, I just leave it at SEMPTY drop 2997 because that's the frame rate I'm working at. You can actually add a summary for your project in here and do some audio CD settings. I don't tend to touch this stuff here just because you don't tend to need to. So you can just click that, and that will basically create a new project for us at those settings. So I set it back to 720p, I believe. Yes, I did. Alright, so now our project's all set up, and it's time to start importing clips. So we can actually just work with the Project Media tab right here, and click this button to import media. And this will open a little Explorer window, which will allow us to select clips. We can use all the standard Explorer tools, like holding Control or holding Shift to select multiple clips. And then you just click Open. And then the clip opens in the Project Media. From here, we can actually rename, replace, refresh, etc., recapture offline media, and you can actually create new bins. And bins are basically folders for media clips, and that allows you to organize your clips in a much more advanced project than what a lot of you are probably working on right now. If you're just working on a small project, you can probably just do everything in the default bin. However, you might want to separate things like titles and images and stuff, just so that you kind of know where everything sort of is. Okay, so now we have a clip. How do we work with this? There's no trimmer window. We're not making subclips. You can actually open in Trimmer to make a subclip, but usually in Vegas, that's really not worth doing. The easiest way to work with a clip in Vegas, and by far the fastest, is to click and drag it into the timeline. Once the clip is in the timeline, you can actually drag the end of the clips to mark the in and out point. So right now, the clip comes in much later. It'll be much easier to tell when the thumbnail changes. So now, the start of the clip is when the Pro controller is at the front. So it's easier to cut clips actually in the interface than it is to go through the trimmer. If you want to get really detailed, you can use my tip from before and zoom in on the window just by pushing up a couple times. You can also zoom in by pushing this button and zoom out the same way. But, of course, just pushing up tends to be a little faster. And we can drag this back out, and there you go. It's back to the normal size. A very interesting tip is if you're over the edge and you push Control, you'll see how there's a little wavy line over here. That means that it's actually going to change the speed of the clip. And you'll see now that the clip is adjusted, there is a zigzag line over the video clip. So now the clip would actually run, because I've made it smaller, that's the same amount of video in less time, so the video will actually have sped up.
I was waiting until this arrived to do the review. Why did I wait? Because this is actually the most comfortable controller I have ever held.
So, of course, I didn't drag it too far, so it's not extremely faster. To do that, we could drag it all the way over here. And let's see how fast this is going now.
There is only one level of sensitivity in the games I play. Are you gaming? Yes. Are you shooting? Yes. In competitive first-person shooters, there are people that mod their 360 controllers.
So as you can see, it got a lot faster that time. We can just undo a couple times, or Control-Z. That works. You can also do it the opposite way. Hold Shift and drag the other way to make things slower.
I wish I had the PS Vita still for the...
Blah, blah, blah. You get it. It's pretty simple. It's actually a lot easier than a lot of other programs when it comes to stretching clips. And now to resample a clip, that is actually interesting, because a lot of clips are not going to be at the same frames per second as your project. And Vegas, by default, will try to resample every clip. And this is important, because if they resample your clip and it's in the right frame rate, or if... Honestly, I always disable resample, even if it's in a different rate, or I force a resample to a different rate. So say I was working in 30, and I needed 29.97, I could just click the down button from 30, and it would go to 29.97. But the Smart Resample, if you keep this on, your clips will end up blurry, because it will try to resample, and it won't look good. Plus, because it's resampling your clip, it's going to take a lot longer to render. So typically, if your frame rate on your video is the same as your project, you should disable resample on every clip. There's sadly not an easier way to do this, but a lot of people work in Vegas and have really bad final footage, and this is actually the culprit. There's a couple other settings in here, but they're basically just your video and audio settings. So if for some reason your clip is not interlaced and it's supposed to be, you can actually go in here and adjust that. If the rotation's off, if it's upside down, you can actually fix that in here as well. I mean, typically you're not going to have to adjust this, but on occasion you could get a clip that just wigs out on you. So just know that that is available. Now, there are a couple last tips in here. I've talked about how to resize your clip so you can actually work with clips as if they were subclips, and anything you do with this will not affect the actual clip. Whenever you drag a clip in here, it acts as a subclip. So I can actually drag another copy in here. I can delete that copy, nothing happens. So every clip in the timeline is a subclip by default. Okay, so at this point we've already talked a little bit about how you adjust the duration or the speed of your clip. But how would you make a cut, you might ask? Well, that's actually really simple. You just get your marker and you move it to the place that you want to make the cut. Of course, you can use the left and right buttons to adjust this more accurately. Of course, you can zoom in to make it even more accurate than that. But once your marker is where it's supposed to be, it's as simple as pushing the letter S. And then each of these counts as their own clip, and you can adjust them freely. Of course, they're both basically parented to this clip up here. They're basically each their own instance of it. So if you want to go here, you can actually drag this out, and you'll have a portion of this clip in here. So basically, every instance of these clips becomes basically an instance of its parent clip. If you want them to be their own clip, you can actually go in here and create subclip. I've never needed to do that for any actual purpose, but the option is there. So of course we can just delete this. You can split a clip in another way, but this way is really not suggested. You can go up here into the edit menu and click split, but of course at that point it's clicking through multiple menus. All you have to do in this way is just get the marker to where you go and S. Editing in this program is extremely simple. Okay, so now we have two clips and we want to make a transition. For something a little bit more advanced than a cut, you can actually drag two clips over each other and they will make a crossfade automatically. Now, it will be a little slow to preview this if your computer is not fast enough. So one thing you can do is you can go in, make sure that you have a decent amount of RAM for a dynamic RAM preview. 2048, so that's 2 gigabytes will be allotted for dynamic RAM preview, and we can just go up to Tools, Build Dynamic RAM Preview, and you can also do Shift B. And this will take a little time, but when it's done, we'll have a very good, very fast playback of the transition. Okay, so now we've rendered out the dynamic RAM preview, and we can simply click play and it'll run at real time to play back. Okay, say you want something a little bit more advanced than a crossfade. A very simple way of doing this is to open the transitions menu, choose a transition that you really like. Of course, we have all of these laid out in front of our eyes as a 3D preview. Let's see. Say we want a clock wipe. We can actually drag this over the crossfade, and it will replace the crossfade with that transition. So we can go here, make a selection, and Shift B to dynamically make a RAM preview. Okay, so now the dynamic RAM preview is done. We can push play.
The analog sticks, having access to them right on your finger, feels really good.
And you can see the transition playing back in real time. It's a little bit easier to see on a clock wipe than it was on a crossfade, but yes, adding transitions in Vegas is extremely easy. And actually, at this point, you've been able to adjust duration, adjust speed, cut, add transitions. This is the very basics of editing. You could actually take some clips and make a project right now with what you have. Now say you want to render this project out. You can make a selection and render just the selection, or you could render out the entire project. Now what you do is you go up here, File, Render As, and that'll bring up the render window. Now, you'll have a folder that it'll output to. You can adjust this yourself. You can name the clip, and then you have several presets here. Typically, I do use the main concept AVC AAC, and this is actually a basic MP4. This is what you're going to use typically when you're uploading to YouTube. So typically I will use this, and I'll choose an internet preset. Now, if your computer has a strong graphics card, a very recent one, it will have the ability to enable OpenCL, and you can actually check that in the system under Check GPU. Mine technically does, but it actually crashes the render because it's not really all that powerful. So I have to set this to render using CPU only. If there is no GPU, automatic will by default set to render to CPU only. However, I have a GPU, it's just not that strong, so I manually go in and set to render CPU only. And I could actually save this as a template, just like everything else. You can actually write a note, change its name, etc. And I have done this in the past for different workflows when you have to output to different codecs. It tends to help to make a preset if you're going to use it often. This is actually very good for a basic project. You can actually set the quality in here for the actual render, so if you want best quality, you can do that there. And then when everything's done, okay. And then render. And now the clip will be rendering. It'll take a little time. It'll take a lot longer than the actual clip length. This project's really long, so it would take a really long time. But as you can see, it's rendering it out. Okay, so if your render's all finished, at this point you've made your first Vegas video. If you like this video, if this helped you out, feel free to leave a like down below. If you have any questions, leave a comment and I will respond to them as soon as possible. Thank you guys, and I'll see you again later for episode 2. Bye guys.